Hey everyone, welcome back to another Bible study, as it were. So we're coming to the end of our Genesis series. You'll notice I'm not doing the two genealogies that bookend this particular text. They're very stylized. If you have any questions about them, feel free to ask me. They're hard to preach and teach. That they don't have kind of the same as the genealogies before the flood or the antediluvian. These post-diluvian genealogies have to do with the development of who Israel is. So I'm doing this story in the middle. I think the story in the middle is really the last big narrative, and of course we know as the Tower of Babel, or Babel, as some people call it. What's important about this text is I think what this writer has done brilliantly is he's just built up this ongoing increasing chaos. We have the judgment of chaos and chaos, but then we saw in the Noah account that things are actually getting worse. And then we have this story that's kind of post dates obviously the flood because there's multiple peoples and it's meant to post date it, but this predates Israel by a long way. So this is a story that finds itself before Israel, so into the Mesopotamian Assyrian tradition. So that's why we know a lot about it. And like the rest of the stories within these texts, there's definitely a agenda of God here to point out the difference between himself and the other gods. And again, we see that in this story. There is another story within the ancient world, within the Mesopotamian Assyrian tradition, a creation part of the creation narratives, where the gods separate humanity again with language, but they do it for very different reasons. Um, Again, within this story, we need to understand the culture. We need to understand the religion. That helps us. Remember, it's written to them, not to us. It's written for us, and it's only going to help us to understand it and what is trying to be said. It's also setting up an amazing end to this. Chapter 11, we're going to go into chapter 12, and the narrative style is going to change. We're going to go to Abram. It's still stylized to an ancient text, but it's not this kind of creation narrative anymore. The genre is going to change. So I'm going to end at chapter 11, and next week we'll start into Ephesians, which I'm really excited to do. Just so you know, the text itself it is written very creatively in such a way that it's setting us up for Abram or Abraham, and the beginning of God revealing himself to the people of God as a different God than the other gods. And this is part of the example, and it explains why Israel's running into all these other gods and what they're like. So let's get right into it. You guys know this text. I'm going to try and take you into what maybe you don't see. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. This is directly from the other creation narratives. There was a time in antiquity where their whole earth, the Assyrian Mesopotamian Empire, you should do. I highly recommend. I've been watching some documentaries on it out of interest. How influential and how we see the Gilgamesh epic and how influential it was in the ancient world, and how this story that we have in our Gospels not only contradicts it, but it really undermines the ancient pagan mythology. So I highly recommend that. So, and as people migrated from the east, we continue to see the east in this creation story. The stylized way of writing this is, we remember, they leave to the east when they kicked out of the garden. We've got Cain is moved to the east. The east is moving further and further away from God. For sure, that's what that means, and they're moving away from God. They found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. This is in the Assyrian Mesopotamian Empire. All right. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And for they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Mortar. There. This is a. I've heard a sermon recently, or somebody speaking on this, that this was them undermining the way God told them to build. There's just no evidence of that. This is how they built in the Assyrian Mesopotamian area. In Israel, they will build differently, but in the Assyrian Mesopotamian region, this is how they built, and it's a style of building that they made with the materials they had at the time that made them like stone. All right, these bricks. All right. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So their purpose is that they want to build this temple around a city. Now, is the question about building a city? That's the first thing. Well, I don't think so. There never seems to be, though Israel is very much a nomadic people, especially at the beginning, cities aren't the ultimate problem. And obviously, in the end, in Revelation, it's the city of God that comes down. Has to do not with the cities or even building a tower. Towers don't seem to have a problem. It's the purpose of this tower. And that's where the point of this text lies. They don't want to be dispersed. They want to make a name for themselves. Now, some people have argued, and I think there's some truth to this, that some of the issue is how many times they say us in this text. This is about human beings trying to be like God. I think there's some truth to that. I think there's some truth, definitely, that there's some pride here. But I think there's something else going on, and I agree with most of the commentators that what they're building is a ziggurat. I should have put a picture of it, but I will on Sunday. A ziggurat was built in such a way that you would build this great temple, and then up at the top floor, you put a bedroom for the god. It was meant to reach into the heavens. It was so big compared to what was around you. And it was the center of your geopolitical, religious world. And outside, you would have the city and sometimes with the walls surrounding it. And what we found with these ziggurats back in the ancient world is what did they believe they were doing? And this is the issue at hand. When you built the ziggurat, what you were building was building a stairway. It was not so that you might go up into heaven, okay? It was so that you could bring down the god and serve it food so that it would give you blessings. This is a transactional religious arrangement. What's going on in the ancient world is these ziggurats were built so that the gods would be able to come down. In other words, they felt this ziggurat, there is no stairway from heaven down. It's not about going up. And at the top, you built a place where he could rest or she could rest, as the case may be. So the criticism here is that these gods thus become down from heaven and they become very human. They have food needs. They have sexual desires like in any human being. And I think where the Old Testament, where the Genesis account is going to show us, is that our God's nothing like this. Our God has no needs. He is not needy. He is all about his holiness, his truth. He is not transcendent. He doesn't come downstairs. He doesn't need a bedroom. He doesn't need a temple to dwell in. He dwells in their temple to accommodate them at one point around the world that he's in to make himself known as greater than the other gods, but he's never bound by that, as we know. So what's going on here is there's a critique that they have warped in their desire to be like God, knowing good from evil, in this desire to be autonomous. They have created gods in their image. And their image means they've made very human-like gods, and that's the problem. They have come together, they don't want to be dispersed, and they believe that if they go and create this god that's needy to them and then provides for them in lieu of the food and the drink and the sexual favors or whatever else this god may want, this God would provide favors. And they believe that would unify them with the protection of this view of God. And our God comes in and sees this and says, this is bad. Because if we allow this to continue, they will disperse this and they will be able to galvanize themselves around this false view of God and do great damage not only to the people around them, but also to themselves. And so it's actually a judgment, but it's also a mercy. This keeps these gods from dominating. And what happens when you have the languages scattered in languages and empires, it doesn't mean this type of God ceases to exist, but it isn't just one picture of this God. As we know in paganism, there's a multiplicity of gods with every different language. And then they begin to compete in the ancient world. But what this story is saying is that this original paganism, this original world where you dominate this God, where this God comes down and eats at your dinner table, this kind of view of God originally was the dominant one that comes out instead of the worship of the living God from the creation narrative. And juxtaposing these, you end up with this incredibly troubling story, as it were. So, and the Lord came down to see the city. There's no doubt that he's playing that, but our Lord doesn't come down the stairs. You don't have to see he comes down the stairs, but there is a coming. He's observing this from afar, and the tower which the children of man had built. So we've got this idea that this is not the original man, but this is the children of Adam, and that's definitely this is the fruit of the Adamic sin. These are the children. This is what they bring. Then the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do." So they will take this false vision of God and they will dominate the earth. because these gods serve them. They can also manipulate the gods. This isn't a god that reveals themselves to them, that brings any criticism to them. These gods in the ancient world had no morals. They were contractual gods. They were very, I don't even know the word I want to look for here, but they were very pliable. They had no, and you couldn't trust them because in one moment they might be for you, and another minute they might not. That's the problem when you make gods in your image is these gods aren't the real gods, so you really can't trust it. So you have to constantly hope that you're giving the right sacrifice, and we'll talk more about that on Sunday. Definitely, there's gods like this today, obviously. Uh, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. In other words, when they do this, they will create a world for them. They will create a religious system that backs for them, and they will do whatever they want on the earth for them. It doesn't mean they will be able to be like God and they will be able to uh, recreate or do incredible things like superheroes. This is talking about this possibility to go and dominate. And if they create this religion without, and there's just this one overarching religious theme that's false, they'll be able to use that, and the empires will use that to dominate. Of course, what happens is we see in paganism that, of course, these gods ultimately serve the hierarchy, the elitists. This is not the god of the weak and the broken. These are never gods of the weak and the broken, and they oppress. And so, religion in paganism is very much a useful tool for the leaders, even though the leaders, it turns out, end up being just as bound by these gods as they have to continue to sacrifice to these gods, and they hope they have the right thing. So that's what's going on here. You have the ziggurat. They built this place with a bedroom up top. You got the food down there, and they're coming down, and God sees it and goes, "Boy, if they do this, this is, if we don't do something about this, they're going to go out and dominate and create a religion that's going to destroy, and nothing will be impossible." And we've seen what happens in the judgment of the flood. The man is not good, and you have to understand that when you're reading this. There's no inclination that humanity is good at this point. Humanity is warped. We saw it with the Noah story. We've got a situation that's really getting out of hand. So we end up with that situation. Come, let us go down. And they're confused, their language. We've got this going down again. You see, he's coming down, but he's not coming down to be served food. He's coming down there with a judgment. I always believe that this judgment is also a mercy on them, because if he doesn't come and do what he's doing, they are going to use this religious system and dominate and destroy. And by doing this, he is not allowing them to do what they call the impossible for themselves. Let us go down there and confuse their language so they may not understand one another's speech. Now, of course, that leads to dispersing. They had built this tower so they wouldn't be dispersed because they were going to use these gods to their advantage. The god that comes down does the exact opposite because he can't be used. He can't be dominated. He can't be manipulated. He can't be cajoled. This, our God, the living God, is a God like no other in the ancient world. And this story is a powerful testimony because the gods are set. The gods split the languages in the other ancient texts for their advantage, so other gods can be fed, so that they can disperse, and the other gods can have their needs met. In our case, this is not the case. He's doing this to stop them from this religious cycle. Now they're going to go out and continue this religious cycle. Thus, we see the beginning of Abraham, where you begin to see the revelation of the true God in the midst. Now remember, Abraham comes out of this Assyrian Mesopotamian world, out of the city called Ur. They worshipped a sun god who definitely, there's a good chance they would have had a tower. They would have believed that God came down, and our God's going to take the pagan Abram out of that and begin what we later call Israel and the true people of God. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. So the tower is already built, as we know, or they're building the tower, but they left off building the city. And now, in other words, they become a nomadic people. This is part of the judgment. And of course, we know in the ancient world that by the time Israel was around, there's lots of nomadic peoples. All right. Therefore, its name is called Babel. Babel means gate of the gods. That undoubtedly means they have the gate to let the god in. But it later becomes the word for confusion. There's undoubtedly, this is to do with the name of the city Babylon. It's a judgment story on Babylon. Babylon was the dominant, by the time of the writing of this narrative, Babylon by far has become one of the dominant city states and part of the Assyrian Empire. They become Israel's enemy. And this is a judgment on this religious system. Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So Babel becomes confusion rather than the city gate of the God. From there, the Lord dispersed them all over the face of the earth. So again, let's remind ourselves what the criticism here is, that the real God, he does come down, not through their staircase. He comes down to see what's going on, whatever they're doing by creating this control. They're controlling the God. They're providing his food. They're manipulating. And of course, through that, the God will do whatever they want, because their gods have no morals. They have no standards. So the leaders can manipulate that and dominate. And God does this as a judgment upon them, the false gods. All right. So let's get into the questions. Number one, the problem of Babel was in the people making God in their image. How might this be the fruit of the temptation of the serpent in Genesis 3? You will be like God, knowing good and evil. How might this be a warped promise, or the fruit of that particular temptation? And we've already seen that God wanted to eventually give them wisdom to knowing good and evil, but they have taken that upon themselves, and how they might manipulate that in this particular narrative. All right. The foundation of the sin and evil in humanity. Question 2. The foundation of the sin and evil in humanity is idolatry. How does idolatry, or a false view of God, create death, sin, and evil in cultures that embrace this? If we create these gods, how do they end up binding us to death? So I'll leave that with you and let you guys discuss how false views of God in a culture destroys people. All right. And how might idolatry enter into the church today? This is a very real problem. One of the true foundations of our movement, called the Reformation, or the Reformed tradition, was against idolatry in the medieval Catholic Church. And it had a form, and it was idolatrous. But one of the things that the Reformers always wanted us to do is be aware of idolatry in our midst. And I can tell you that idolatry has snuck into the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So we aren't always aware of it. And so how might you see that today? What examples might we have of idolatry sneaking into the North American church? That's also, so culturally locate how we create gods compared to theirs. And what is the antidote to this temptation to idolatry? I hope you can figure that one out pretty quick. It has to do, I'll give you a hint, with the incarnation. All right. Have a great day.